All right, hello everyone. Welcome to Module 10. In this module, we're going to talk about, they call them porous nodes, uh, but what we're talking about here are points of entry into the United States. So these points of entry are really kind of a specific homeland security vulnerability, right? Because just by their very nature, they're vulnerable to attacks from outside the United States. So an important concept, in this conversation of porous nodes is critical infrastructure and key resources. All the things we're going to talk about in this module all fall under these critical infrastructure or key resources. So there's a bunch of critical infrastructure sectors that have been identified by DHS. We're talking about assets, systems, networks. Can be physical or virtual, but things that are so vital to the United States that if they're incapacitated or destroyed, they would have a debilitating effect on security, national economic security, public health, national economic security, safety, security, or any other combination of these things. These are things that are so vital to the United States that if something happened to them, we'd be in a real world of hurt. So when we start talking about these porous nodes and entry points, they're very extensive, right? So there's uh, lots of them, right? So it makes them vulnerable just because of the sheer number of entry points and departure locations. So we're talking about seaports, right? How many seaports are there in the United States? Well, there's hundreds. How many airports? Hundreds of airports. Then start talking about the northern and southern borders. Okay, so we're talking about very, very extensive entry points. Um, so how do you deal with those from a homeland security standpoint? Table 10.1 is a nice table that kind of outlines these critical infrastructures, who's in charge of them. It'll give you a real nice idea, of kind of what we're talking about. All right, so first we're going to talk about is aviation security. Okay, so assaults against aviation, it's kind of a favorite among extremists. You don't have to go very far to Google search to find incidences of terrorism, involving airplanes. But why? Why do they pick airplanes? Well, it's because of the significant symbolic value of it. First of all, look at me. I got through all your security. We took over this plane, right? There's a lot of symbolic value in that. And also, they're hubs of commerce, and they have a lot of economic value because we're not talking about just people, right? So you have all this cargo, all these things that move, on airplanes. So there are these huge hubs of commerce where if something happens, they get shut down. That's going to cause a lot of economic damage to the United States. Now, again, and we're not just talking about planes either. We're also talking about the airports. Those airports are also targets as well. They like them because they're fairly soft targets. Um, there is security at airports, but it's not real extensive security, right? There's not a lot protecting the airports from the outside, uh, and also provides a lot of international media coverage. Right, if something happens to an airplane, especially an international flight, that's going to be all over the news, all over the world. They also like it because they can use a lot of different weapons. You can use rocket-propelled grenades. You could use precision-guided munitions, plastic explosive, pipe bombs, vehicular bombs, barometric bombs, um, or you can actually just use knives. You can get them on an airplane, things where you could hijack the actual airplane. Um, One thing, short of just blowing up planes, they also frequently do this stuff with the seizure of hostages. And there's a lot of instances of this throughout history where planes are hijacked, hostages are taken, and then they try to get some kind of concessions because of it. So, how do you secure the aviation sector? Well, it's very, very hard, and especially to have comprehensive aviation security, just due to the size and complexity of the systems throughout the country. Because we're not talking about just like the major airports, like Kansas City and St. Louis, or New York, Reagan Internet. Like we're not talking about just those. You've got this whole wide spectrum of private and public sector aircraft and airport operators. There's almost 20,000 private and public use airports, lots of facilities, equipment, services, airspace, right? You have all these various things that all come into this aviation security. It's not just planes and hubs. Like you got to think about all of that stuff. And it also continues to grow. The aviation is not just this static, well, we have these airports and that's all we have to worry about. There's new planes, there's more planes, airports are expanding. So it continues to grow. In addition to all that, you now have thousands of flights daily and millions of tons of freight every year. So think about how extensive that is, and think about it across the country. The size of the United States, 20,000 private and public use airports. Okay, thousands of flights, millions of tons of freight. Like you're talking about a very, very extensive sector. All right, so what have we learned about aviation security and infrastructure security, from the new terrorism environment? Well, 9/11 proved to us that infrastructure and key assets are high-value terrorism targets. Okay, the 2003 National Strategy for the Physical Protection of Critical Infrastructures and Key Assets identified three effects of the terrorist attack. You have direct infrastructure effects, which is kind of this cascading disruption of the functions of critical infrastructures through direct attacks on a critical node, system, or function. You have indirect infrastructure effects, which is disruption and financial consequences for government, society, and the economy through reactions to the attack. That can be sometimes mitigated through assessment of policy and regulatory responses by understanding the psychology of the impacts. But that's kind of what terrorists want, right? They want these consequences as a reaction. And then you have exploitation of the infrastructure itself, where elements of the particular infrastructure disrupt or destroy another target. All right, so unique protection challenges for aviation. We already talked about some of these, but one is just volume, millions of passengers, even more baggage and cargo, limited capabilities and available space. So detection equipment and methods are limited, right? Capabilities limited, ease of use is limited. You have cargo that's time sensitive. Any delay in transporting cargo negatively impacts the economy. Security versus convenience, right? You have to maintain security, but you also can't have people waiting at the airport for hours and hours and hours where you have all this congestion and delays because that complicates it. Okay, so you have to find this happy medium between security and also getting cargo out in time, getting people where they need to go, right? So that's a very difficult thing to manage. Okay, and people already complain about how long things take at the airport. To really, really lock down an airport, it would be unreal how long it would take for those things to happen. So they have to find this medium between doing their best to keep everybody safe, but also getting people on their way and getting cargo going where it needs to go. Accessibility is another unique protection challenge because they're open to the public. Okay, there's public roads nearby, right? Airports are not difficult to get into, right? People have to be able to get into them. You have these huge parking lots, you got parking garages, some of them underground. You got shuttles running, like you got all these things going on. So there's a lot of accessibility to airports that a terrorist could possibly use to their advantage. All right, so after 9/11, obviously, aviation security was put under a microscope. So in 2003, the national strategy emphasized that you need to identify vulnerabilities, interdependencies, and remediation requirements, potential threats to passengers, have to be able to improve security at key points of access, increase cargo screening capabilities, and then identify and improve detection technologies. Right? Those are all things that needed to happen as a result of 9/11. So out of these recommendations, the Transportation Security Administration was formed. Well, it was actually formed as a result of the Aviation Transportation Security Act of 2001, but it kind of arose out of these recommendations. Like the TSA became what TSA is because of these recommendations from the national strategy. Okay, so in addition to TSA, they also enacted other security measures. They restricted access to terminals and gates. When I was a kid, you could just walk in and go to gates and like meet people at the gate and that sort of thing. Well, you can't do that stuff anymore, right? So there's restricted access to the terminals and the gates. There's bomb sniffing dogs. They have enhanced passenger screening. So all those things were also implemented after 9/11. All right, so real quick on the Aviation and Transportation Security Act of 2001, it mandated the creation of the Transportation Security Administration. So then by November 2002, required replacement of the previous contractor run screening process with TSA screeners. So before this, contractors were in charge of screening at the airports. So wherever that was being done, TSA took over for that by November 2002, and then by December of 2002, all baggage uh, had to be screened through an explosives detection system. All right, so that's aviation security. Now let's talk about border security. Okay, so we're talking about the northern and southern border. However, most of the focus is always on the southern border because uh, it's easier to navigate. If you think about the border with Canada, there's a lot of places where it'd be really, really hard for somebody to walk across the border. Okay, so most of the focus is always on the southern border. Well, DHS has the primary responsibility for protecting the border. Coast Guard, Customs and Border Protection, and Immigration Customs Enforcement are all responsible for that. So when you're talking about homeland security threat scenarios, we're talking about things like border security, drug smuggling, illegal immigration. Uh, Extremists could also potentially use these illicit channels, that they use for drug smuggling or human trafficking or illegal immigration to enter the country. That's a plausible scenario. There hasn't been much evidence that they're doing that. Uh, to this point, most of the evidence points to people entering the country legally and then maybe overstaying their visas or that kind of thing. Um, but it's impossible to ignore the fact that extremists could use, if they're getting drugs and smuggling people and all this stuff into the country, obviously it's very plausible that someone means to do us harm, a terrorist, could also use those illicit channels to get into the country. So one of the main challenges with securing the border is unauthorized immigration. So if you're talking about unauthorized immigration, um, so there's a social and political challenge associated with this, and this really is a significant homeland security dimension. There's lots of discussion and debate. If you're paying any attention to the news, they're talking about it all the time, and there's really strong beliefs on both sides of this debate. So you have really strong beliefs on both sides. You have people in the middle. This is probably one of the most debated issues relative to homeland security in the recent past. So there's two main points of contention here. So one side says the border should be sealed, period, and use the military if it's needed. The opposing view to that is that the U.S. should have moderate but effective procedures to focus on unauthorized immigration from regions that harbor terrorists. So we should be worrying about places or unauthorized immigrants from places where they're known to harbor terrorists. The second point of contention, one side says unauthorized immigrants should be identified and deported. The opposing view to that is that the U.S. should establish some kind of reasonable amnesty procedures. Now, I don't see this getting resolved anytime soon. Like, this debate has been going on and going on and going on. And unless everybody can kind of get together and agree that we need to figure something out instead of just arguing about it, this is going to continue to be a homeland security problem. All right. Another issue of the southern border is crime and insecurity. There's extensive transnational organized crime and smuggling networks in some regions of Latin America. Um, so that has created, the opportunity for extremists to enter the U.S., but also for drugs and human smuggling and, lots of that sort of stuff too. There's two main areas of particular concern. The tri-border area of South America, That's the borders of Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina. They specialize in drug smuggling, money laundering, and the transfer of money to Middle Eastern extremist groups. Much of the smuggling is done by Hezbollah. The three countries themselves are friendly to the U.S., but they pose a threat because extremists could pose as travelers and enter the U.S. Through neighboring countries. And it's a problem down there because you have this kind of combination of kind of weak government, an organized criminal economy, and then also political extremism. So when you combine those things, it really poses a security challenge, not only to the region, but also to the United States. Then the other area of concern is the Mexican drug war. Drug trade is lucrative. There are some extremist movements and terrorists that utilize the drug trade to raise money. There's very large criminal enterprises that have developed, due to the drug trade. Cartels don't get along. They're rivals. Violence is commonplace. The cartels are really good at transporting drugs into the U.S. So that Mexican drug war, has a way of some of that violence, spilling over into the United States. So that's the other area, main area of concern. All right, so how do we patrol the border? What are some of our security considerations that we need to make, when we're talking about securing the border? So first of all, things have evolved dramatically from the early 20th century to the 21st century. This is a constantly evolving thing. It's changed. It's constantly changing. And if you look at how things have changed over time, each evolution, very clearly reflects the political and security priorities at the time. So a political party gets in and they have a certain belief system. Well, then the policies reflect that belief system, but also security priorities. So if something's happening at some particular point in time, the policies and procedures will reflect that. Okay, so if you look at this over time, you can really get a pretty good idea of one, who's in charge and what were the main security priorities for that administration at the time. So from a practical standpoint, if we're talking about securing the border, some people are like, well, why do we care? Let people in, no big deal. Well, border security is important to Homeland Security because we have no travel restrictions once inside the United States. Okay, so once someone is inside the United States, they can literally go wherever they want, and there's no way to track anybody. Okay, so if you have extremists that make their way across the border, they just disappear into the heartland of the United States, and they can go wherever they want at that point. So securing the border and keeping those people out is going to be important. So how do we harden the border? Well, there's three main agencies that deal with this. Citizenship and Immigration Services, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and Customs and Border Protection are all responsible for border control and security. So first, Citizenship and Immigration Services, they're the ones that supervise legal immigration in the U.S. They implement the immigration laws, the regulations, and procedures. They're the ones that approve or deny citizenship status. They verify a legal right to work for people. They're the ones that do all the procedural stuff for legal immigration. They have about 18,000 people working at 250 different sites, so it's pretty extensive. But they handle all the legal immigration issues into the United States. There's Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They're the investigative and enforcement arm for federal criminal and civil laws pertaining to immigration, border control, customs, and trade. They're the second largest federal law enforcement investigative agency, around 20,000 people. They're the principal border control agency within the Homeland Security enterprise, and they're organized into task-centered program offices and directorates. Two of ICE's missions are administered by two distinct directorates. You have enforcement and removal operations. Okay, they identify, detain, and remove illegal aliens from the United States, with a priority on those who pose a threat to national security, criminals, fugitives, things like that. Homeland Security Investigations is the other. They're responsible for the investigation of immigration crime, human rights violations, human smuggling, smuggling of narcotics, weapons, contraband, financial crime, cybercrime, those sorts of things. They have about 10,000 special agents in 200 different cities and 47 countries. All right, ICE also has several initiatives. They have the Border Enforcement Security Task Force. I'm not going to go into each of these, but make sure you know what these are. The Border Enforcement Security Task Force, you have the National Security Investigations Division, the Counterproliferation Investigations Unit, the National Security Unit, the Counterterrorism and Criminal Exploitation Unit, and Joint Terrorism Task Force. All right, fine. Now, Customs and Border Protection. Okay, they have the frontline mission of securing the borders in the U.S. They were founded in 2003, and they're the federal government's primary border security arm. Their principal mission is homeland security. Their priority mission is keeping terrorists and weapons out of the United States. Okay, but they're also responsible for securing the border and facilitating lawful international trade and travel, while also enforcing all these hundreds of U.S. laws and regulations. Okay, so within this Customs and Border Protection, you have the Border Patrol, which is a central component of it, but also has the Office of Air and Marine, which is the world's largest aviation and maritime law enforcement organization. All right, so that's border security. Now, port security. So with port security, you have to protect the flow of commerce while addressing security concerns. Okay, so you need the cooperation of everybody that's responsible for port security. So DHS is, but mainly it's the Coast Guard and Customs and Border Protection, along with Department of Transportation. If you're going to do a threat analysis of maritime infrastructure, this is really pretty uncomplicated. It's pretty straightforward and really pretty easy to develop plausible scenarios. So historically, maritime targets have not been a high priority for terrorists. When was the last time you heard about a shipping vessel getting attacked or something happening at a port? Right? It's really pretty rare. There's relatively few attacks on maritime versus other infrastructure, like aviation. So why? Why? You would think that would be something that they would target. So what they believe is that even though you could use shipping containers, to smuggle people or weapons into the U.S., the belief is that terrorists think that other methods are just more efficient. Yeah, we could do that, but it's easier to do it this way. The other thing is maritime infrastructure really, generally speaking, doesn't offer any opportunity for a mass casualty attack. Now, the exception would be a cruise ship, right, where you have a lot of people on a cruise. But outside of that, there really isn't the opportunity for a mass casualty type attack. So it may not be worth the effort to try to attack something like this. However, if someone would do that, it's possible others would also attempt it. Like if they saw that, hey, they did that, and it worked pretty well, and they got a lot of publicity, and you might see a rise in it if somebody tried it, but nobody really attempts it. But that doesn't mean that port security is not important, because it is. All right, so if you're talking about port security, there's multiple components to that. You got ports, you got offloaded cargo, you got ships, you got waterways, you got transportation systems, and the ports are these gateways into the American heartland. So ports are really important, but just the sheer size of this all and the complexity, really has significant challenges, just like everything else that we're talking about. The sheer size of the United States and the complexity of the systems we have here really creates significant challenges when you're talking about security. But there was an initiative in 2002 called the Container Security Initiative, and that helped kind of integrate seaport security into the Coordinated Homeland Security System. So if you're trying to develop maritime initiatives, like every other type of initiative, you have to identify your vulnerabilities. What are your interdependencies? What are best practices? Planning. You have to develop a plan for implementing the security measures, depending on threat level. You have to enhance maritime domain awareness. You have to have international cooperation, right? You're dealing with international trade. You're talking about international ships So you got to have international cooperation. Um, you have to have better guidelines. You have to improve waterway security. Right? These are all pretty straightforward kind of initiatives when you're talking about trying to secure something. All right. That's the end of this module. So I'm going to stop there. As always, please do your assignments and let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you in the next module.